bad. They're facing like a plague going on in their world. Should I have plague as a theme? Yeah. I am excited to get started. Welcome to CC Writes. My name is CC Lucky, and today I am prepping for NaNoWriMo. I have this board here that I set up, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of mind mapping to get myself started and see what kind of story that I come up with. Alright, so let's get started. I was kind of wanting to do, normally with NaNoWriMo, I want to do something that sort of I'm already good at. If I'm challenging myself, typically I'll go with something that I haven't done before. That way I can get experience writing in different ways so that I can pull it into my major stories. With NaNoWriMo, because you're doing everything in 30 days, it's a lot more difficult to do something that you haven't done before because the whole thing is already a challenge. So I am going to actually just work in something that's already in my wheelhouse, which for me means I'm gonna have to do either fantasy or literary fiction, which are the two genres that I typically write in most often. But because my last couple of stories were literary fiction, I think I'm gonna go with fantasy today because I haven't done it in a while, and I think it would just be a nice break from what I typically do. So I'm gonna try to come up with a fantasy story, long story short. So I'll write that in. So I want it to be fantasy. Oh man, I write really small. I'm gonna have to make it a lot bigger. I want it to be, I have a few ideas that I've had on the back burner for a fantasy story. I actually just came across in one of my old notebooks something that I had written a little bit of in the past, but it was mostly just like character sketches. So I might do something like that. I also have a story that I was working on and trying to make a sci-fi, but if I actually made it fantasy instead, that would be kind of fun. It was one that I actually streamed before. It was based on the idea of a title, which was called Garbage Town, and having a story, having a high fantasy story called Garbage Town, I think would be kind of fun as well. So let's see, where do we start? I've got a puppy who keeps trying to get into my lap. Let's start with the thing that seems most fun to me right now, which is the Garbage Town story. So Garbage Town is the idea of this impoverished area. I also think that if we go into topics like substance use, poverty, homelessness, things like that would be really interesting in a fantasy setting. Yeah, so I think that's what I'm gonna go with. So this is my major idea, and we're gonna say themes are substance use, homelessness / poverty. So those are some strong themes to go with in the story. I'm wondering if there are any other themes that I might benefit from as well for something like this. So because I do want it to be kind of high fantasy, some of the things that I need to work on are world building, characters. With fantasy, and especially with high fantasy, it's important to have characters that fill out certain roles in the story. I've taken classes on this both academically and on my personal time, and I want to make sure that all of the roles are properly filled in the story, but I also don't want to fall into the trap of doing a ridiculous trope. So I'll have to be really careful when it comes to the characters. Some other things that I'll need to think about for this are the settings, the action. It's really important to have action, like a really action-driven story, especially if you want it to be character-based, because people do things. They don't always just sit around and think about stuff. Well, I mean, you could make an argument for that as well. But I want it to be, you know, kind of like an action movie where things are happening. Action and setting. Setting goes along with world building, but I'm actually thinking more of a, like, world building is the culture and government and money and magic and all of that kind of stuff that goes into it. And setting, I'm actually talking about the physical place that they're going to be. So whether it's a city or if it's out in the countryside, or if they're going out adventuring, are they going to go through the woods? Are they going to go through the mountains? Are they going to do both? What other things do I need into this? Well, let me expand on some of the other things while I think about it, such as world building, because there are a few things that I need to make sure that I take care of. For instance, it's fantasy, so there's obviously got to be magic. We're also going to need government, a culture. We'll need the people who populate the magic land. For characters, we need things like a protagonist, an antagonist. You'll typically have somebody who's a mirror to the protagonist. You'll have the guide, the mentor, the temptress. Who else? There's a whole host of people. Oh, there's the trickster. So those are all important character archetypes to have within the story. I feel like I'm missing out on some character archetypes, but I think this is a good enough list for right now, so I'm just gonna mark that out. And when it comes to the setting, we're actually gonna need multiple settings. It is a fantasy story after all, but also there is the world as it is and the new world, as well as the antagonist lair, or basically the place where the final conflict will take place. So I'll put those in. This is actually why isekai stories are so popular, because it has such a drastic jump from the world as it is to the new world, and everything that you see in it is such a stark contrast, and that really hits hard with a lot of people, where it goes from something that feels really normal to something that's like magical, and maybe something like this could happen to me. I really like that about those kind of stories, even though they are used quite a bit nowadays, but they're popular because it works. So some other things that I'm going to need to think about. We'll talk about action. To me, action is just plot. So I'll think about the individual things that need to go into a plot. Like, the main character will typically have like happiness and satisfaction in their world right at the beginning of the story. Even if it's not happiness and satisfaction, it's a world that they're used to. It's something that they can deal with, and they understand how everything works. Everything is in status quo, and they like the status quo, and they're not really looking for anything to change. So you have everything in status quo, but despite that, there's something that they want, and they're working hard to try and get. So the thing that they want leads them to do something that either propels them into a new world if you're working on a shorter story, or if you're working on a longer story, then what will typically happen is, in the pursuit of the thing that they want, the inciting incident for the story happens, which in this case makes sense for it to be that pattern. They want something, so they do something about it, and in doing something about it, everything falls apart. They either feel like it's their fault, or they'll feel like there's something that they could possibly do to make everything go back to the way that they want it to be. This is a very like Toy Story representation of plot, and I love Toy Story, so we're going with that. And what needs to happen after that is they run into the Threshold Guardians. The Threshold Guardians are usually like a set of 3 things. It can be 3 monsters, it can be 3 challenges. All those 3 things are going to cause them to stumble. After they overcome the Threshold Guardians, then they come up against what is ostensibly the main antagonist. They're going to come up against, like, they feel like they have everything under control. They start to go after what they want with renewed vigor, and then the antagonist just slaps them straight in the face. They get to see the antagonist for how powerful they are, and at that point they have a minor success but also a setback. I am quickly running out of room. After the setback happens, what we want to see in the story is you have a low point for the character. They are questioning their life and their choices. They're regretting the fact that they didn't just accept the way that the world is after it changed. They realize that they are the arbiter of their own destruction up to this point. And they have a choice to either keep going and keep pursuing the thing that they've wanted all this time that just keeps slipping further and further away from them. They can accept the way that the world is now, which actually is the temptress role within the story. So yeah, at this point they should arguably face the temptress. And when they face the temptress, one of the greatest things that you can do is have them fail. You'll see this in the Odyssey, actually. It's when he's on the island and he is engaging with, I think it's Calypso. He's basically fallen under her power and is having a relationship with her there. It would be very easy for him to stay there forever, and she has held him up for quite a bit of time, and then he comes to his senses and he has to escape the island. So that's what this part represents in the story, is maybe the main character can accept things as they are, but some deep part of him knows that it's just not right. It's not what he really wants. I'm writing below the screen now, aren't I? So he succumbs to the temptress and then returns to reason, continues the journey, enters the dragon's lair, faces dragon, almost loses, barely wins, returns home, and gets rewarded. All right, so that's a story in a nutshell, the way that a story typically works. And when it comes to action, those are the beats that I need to follow. I'm not always good at it. I try my best, but that's what editing is for. So we've got themes, world building, characters, action, setting. What else am I missing here? No, I think those are the major points that I need to get across. So I've already got a couple of themes that I want to work with. Let's look at setting, because sometimes the setting will give you a good idea for characters. So the setting that I kind of wanted for like a fantasy, like a gritty fantasy kind of story, would be more like an urban center. I also really like the idea of having it set in like slums, because sometimes you'll see the, fantasy cities and everything, but you don't really see like the deep poverty, like what exists in real life, and that would be really fun to explore. So we're gonna have fantasy slums. So that's where the story is going to be at the beginning, when everything is in its status quo. So I'll start here, and now let's think about character a little bit. I had come up with this idea for two fairy girls. Not really fairy girls, they're like elves or fae or something like that. What I wanted from them was they're sisters, and they both experience a similar situation and come out the other side of it completely different. And what that is, they're facing like a plague going on in their world. Should I have plague as a theme? Yeah. So then I could have these two girls as part of it. Maybe it's an integrated city that they live in, but they're still more often than not sectioned off to the slum area as a result of being... Oh, okay, so on my YouTube channel, I have a video that I made a while back. It was one of my 60-second stories, and I came up with the idea of this world where all of the races of fantasy creatures live together, but humans have managed to take power. Humans, of course, are not great, and so they automatically delve into racism and things like that, and so any creatures that are able to use magic are discriminated against. I think I might want to set it into that same world. I think that would be really fun. Yeah, so, what was that one called? I called that one When Mothers Weep. It was the story, it was based off of a trial in, I think it was 1919 or 1920. It might have been 1920. It was the trial of a young woman who had basically, the police broke into her apartment and she and her father hid under the bed. It was during race riots at the time and they were terrified. So the police broke into their apartment even though they had nothing to do with what was going outside. And they ended up shooting one of the police officers and killing him. The trial was rigged from the beginning. Like it was meant to punish them. And, you know, she wasn't given opportunity, like she wasn't given good representation. She didn't have the money for good representation. So it was a really awful situation. When I wrote When Mothers Weep, it was with the idea of that same situation happening with fantasy characters. So maybe I'll set this in the same universe with the same basic system of humans are in power and they're discriminating against the magical creatures. Now, because it was a 60-second story, I did not actually put a lot of thought into everything about it, but what I do remember is that there was a place, the slums were called the Swoop. I remember that. And when we're talking about the government, culture, and people, there are magic race riots going on. Ooh, this is hitting too close to home, my goodness. But it is good to write what you know. So we're putting the humans in power. There has to be a reason that they're in power. And I think it's possibly because of like their mastery of technology, or specifically magic technology maybe. I read a lot of Tamara Pierce, and one of the things that I love about her stories is that it's set as if it were medieval time periods, but she does this really fun thing where she has them have all of the same, you know, basic commodities that we have, but it's all powered by magic. And I think that's a lot of fun, and it's something that I'd like to explore as well. I created this system of magic in the past where I haven't used it much in any of my stories, but you have the idea of, you have magical creatures, you have creatures that can use magic, and rarely you have creatures that can do both. And you also have like elementals, which are sort of creatures of magic. So we'll put that in there. Government, we're gonna say it's a kingdom. In my original story, that was the case. Kind of an authoritarian kingdom. So in some kingdoms, the king is kind of held in check by his lords. Like he has to please his lords in order to be able to put forward different policies that he wants. What I'm gonna have is more of an authoritarian, like I said. So the king is gonna hold ultimate power and basically hold all of his lords in fear. So we're gonna have also different people groups. So these are the basic races that I'm gonna have for right now of fantasy creatures. Well, I mean, I put humans on there, but humans and fantasy creatures. Do I wanna think about money right now? I mean, I could go with a very basic Dungeons and Dragons-esque thing where it's, you know, almost based on a metric system, 10 to 100 to 1,000, making up the different currencies. Yeah, I'll go with that. What I do need to know for sure is how much items cost, or give myself like a base idea of that. And one of the ways to do that is to understand our own currency and the worth of a thing. So for instance, if I know how much a loaf of bread costs, which is, I would say usually around like $1.29 if you're getting like a real cheap bread, then that would give me a clue as to what the cost of other things in the world would be. So let's say 1 penny is a copper, and a loaf of bread would cost a penny. I think that is a logical amount. So we'll think about the characters. So there will be a race of fae who have made contracts with elementals, kind of like a tiefling. Basically, the elementals become their protector. So they'll have either one or multiple guardians depending on their own personal strength. And the main character is one of these creatures. We're gonna say that she's like early 20s. Let's say her personal strength would have attracted multiple elementals to her, but she hasn't quite figured out what those strengths are yet. But I don't want her to be like all powerful. I want her to have a lot to learn. That's definitely a good place to start for the main character. And this is the basis of the main character's desire. She wants to be this third one. If she wants to go to magic school, she has to get past the entrance exam. She also has to get past the fact that creatures like her are not allowed to go to magic college, which means she needs to try and hide who she is as a magic creature, which is harder for her because she has drawn in so many elementals who want to make contracts with her, or who have made contracts with her. So antagonist in this case would be the dean of the magic university. All right, so this is the primary antagonist of my story right now. So this is gonna be the basic idea of my mentor. I haven't yet decided if it's gonna be male or female, but definitely human. So I've got all of this stuff. Yeah, I think that gives me a pretty good start for the story idea. I've pinned down as much of it as I possibly could for that. So I guess the only place to go from here is actually plotting it out, deciding the beats of it and the story that's gonna happen. I'm extremely happy with where this went, and I think this is a good place to end off for the day. So thank you for joining me today on CC Writes. I had a really good time. I hope you had a good time, and I will see you later.